thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at the Library of Virginia. And we are just delighted to welcome historian Dr. Kathleen DuVal, who will be discussing her new Pulitzer Prize winning book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. Dr. DuVal is also the author of Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, and the U.S. history textbook, Give Me Liberty. She is a history professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. DuVal is also a Guggenheim Fellow and has written for The Atlantic, Time Magazine, The New York Times, and The Wall Street Journal. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Kathleen DuVal.
It's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Huge thank you to Catherine Wyatt and to Ashley Craig for inviting me and for facilitating me being here. I'm excited to be part of the tremendous set of talks and events and other things that the Library of Virginia is responsible for. I'm going to talk today from my book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. I will talk some and I will read a little bit from the book to give you a sense of how the book goes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. I wrote this book. I'll show you the cover. If it's backwards or not, but anyway, I wrote this book really because I noticed that it's so often today that we Americans see Native people in so many different public roles in television and movies, arguing cases before the Supreme Court, holding public elected office, in art museums. I would say so many prominent art museums in the United States have held exhibits that include contemporary art by Native artists. And I think for an awful lot of non-Native Americans, it's hard to square this very public, active presence of Native peoples today with what most of us were taught in American history. Generally, we were taught a version of Native American history, if at all, that portrayed Native people as something that is just of the past. That's certainly true in North Carolina. I think often that's true in Virginia and many other parts of the United States. American history has tended to emphasize, when it does even talk about Native Americans at all, to emphasize European colonization, disease, warfare, and then often not continue Native history into the 20th and 21st centuries. So Native American history becomes for a lot of non-Native Americans a story of decline and victimization and an impression that Native peoples were just in the past. And all of that makes it hard, I think, then for many people to understand how Native Americans can be so very much here and very much a part of public conversations and public life these days. So, as a historian in this book, I wanted to bridge that gap for readers to show, as I do, millennium's worth of history. Certainly not all of the history I could have in the last 1,000 years, but a history that stretches over a millennium of Native North Americans, starting before colonialism and going to today, really stretching through sort of how Native nations have survived colonialism to the present day and into the future. So the title is Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. And part of the point is that Native Americans have survived and are still here today, not only as individual Native Americans, but as nations, as communities, as sovereign polities, as nations within the United States. So the book begins before Europeans and other peoples came to North America, when it was all Native America. And one of the things I wanted to do early in the book to make sure that readers understand that there was change, there was history that happened here in North America long, long before 1492. And so there are a couple of chapters that talk about some of that history, a small part of that most recent history of Native America before 1492. And then there are many chapters that try to sort of slow down the centuries after 1492. I think there's often a rush in how we think about, how Americans more generally think about Native history, that kind of assumes that everything changes with the coming of Europeans, and that's really that's true in some places, but for most of the continent, it's really not true. So slow down those centuries after 1492. Um, and then get into the 19th century, 20th century, and the many times in which Native nations have sort of suffered at the hands of various newcomers and how they've survived that time. And then the book ends with the real renaissance that's going on within Native nations and Native communities these days in art and culture and literature and all kinds of things. So, as I said, I'm going to mix in some readings and try to give a sense of each of these eras, just a little hint of what you might learn in the book, which then itself is just a hint of the many, many more topics and books and documentaries and all kinds of ways that you can learn about Native history. So I'm going to start with the beginning of the book, and it puts us in the 20th century, but then begins to push backwards. In the fall of, the 21st century. In the fall of 2016, the road leading into the camp was lined with flags. Lakotas and Dakotas of Standing Rock had been protesting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline since early that year, and recently the growing crowd of protesters had spread to this new and larger camp across the Cannonball River. Flying over the trucks, cars, horses, tents, teepees, newly constructed buildings, and demonstrators were more than 300 flags. Among them, the red, white, and black stripes of the Arapaho Nation, the Northern Cheyenne Morning Star, the purple Hiawatha Belt with 4 white squares and a tree of peace representing the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, and the sand-colored Navajo Nation flag, which shows the outlined shape of the Navajo Reservation today between its 4 sacred mountains, under a rainbow representing its sovereignty. Some people brought American flags, too, but the flagpoles flew the flags of Native nations. The flags and the people who gathered under them displayed not only the protest's wide support among Native Americans, but also the fact that Native nations are still here in North America, despite centuries of colonialism. Today, Indigenous North Americans are citizens of many hundreds of Native nations with sovereign rights within the United States, Canada, and Mexico. When Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland were elected to the U.S. Congress in 2018, they were described as the first Native American congresswomen, but also as citizens of the Ho-Chunk Nation and Laguna Pueblo, respectively. The Standing Rock tribal chairman explained during the No DAPL protests, "We're a nation, and we expect to be treated like a nation." The Standing Rock Sioux were demanding their sovereign rights as a recognized political entity with its own laws and land base. Native supporters came there not just as individuals, but as citizens of Native nations. So one argument, one point of the book is nationhood. And really I want that to stand in counter to some of the ways that Native history has been portrayed in the past. If you think about the very oldest way in which Americans, and in this case mostly non-Native Americans, told Native American history, it was either a tale of supposed savages or primitive people who maybe didn't matter that much, or even sometimes a story where there were no people at all, where North America was a supposed wilderness without societies, without politics or economies or anything that really mattered until Europeans got here. In more recent years, starting in the 20th century, there has been more coverage of Native history and a version of Native history that's closer to the truth. But too often, I feel like that Native American history has gone, as it's told sort of generally, has gone in the other direction, in a direction of simply victimhood, of simply decline and loss. The historian Howard Zinn described Native Americans as naked, tawny, and full of wonder, a not particularly fully human portrayal of people either. And so, as I said before, I think that either of those versions, that older and more horrible one, or the victimization narrative, those both make it hard to understand how so many Native nations survived and are still here around. More recently, historians, tribal scholars, and others have pushed for a more multi-perspectival history, something that tells histories from multiple Native perspectives. And also that connects to the present, that shows that the continuation of Native peoples, of Native nations today, has matters a great deal and is deeply connected to all of that past history, that the past history isn't disconnected with the present. So one of the things I try to do in this book is connect the present to whatever I'm talking about in the past. So the book, as I said, covers 1,000 years of history. There are chapters that are set in, various centuries of the past. But even in those that are set in the fairly distant past, I bring in contemporary voices, contemporary Native voices, to talk about how they see this distant past and how it connects to their present. Another argument of this book is that North America is part of world history and should be in all eras when we teach about world history, even before 1492. So I'm going to read now from the start of chapter 1, which sets North America in world history 1,000 years ago. It is rare that everyone in the world has the same thing on their minds at once. But we know one thing that everyone was talking about in the spring of the year 1006: the star. It had always been in the sky, but now it was 16 times as bright as the planet we call Venus. In some places, it was visible during the day for an entire month and startlingly bright at night for several years. Scientists today say it was the brightest supernova ever recorded. A chronicler in Baghdad wrote, "Its rays on the earth were like those of the moon." A monk in Switzerland recorded, "A new star of unusual size appeared. It was glittering in appearance and dazzling the eyes, causing alarm." Alarm was a common reaction. An Egyptian scholar wrote about wars and famines that followed the star's appearance. Chinese astronomers worried about whether what they called guest stars were auspicious, or as one Chinese scholar put it, a sign that foretells military action, death, and countrywide famine. In our age of electric lights, it's hard to grasp how important the stars were to everyone before the 20th century. People all around the world used the sky to keep track of time. They could see countless more stars than we can today, and many cultures believed that a change in the sky meant something significant was happening. When another supernova appeared in 1054, less than 50 years later, some people believed the skies were telling them to make a change. They moved to new places and adjusted their religious beliefs and practices. Leaders used the skies for guidance and sometimes pointed to them as evidence that people should follow whatever path that leader advised. The capital of the Ghana Empire fell around the time of the 1054 supernova, and its call to change seems to have persuaded many to convert to Islam. Both the Normans and their English adversaries saw the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1066 as predicting the Norman conquest of England, and it's woven into the Bayeux Tapestry. The people of North America watched the sky too. Their calendars were based on changes in the moon and in the sun's position relative to Earth. Archaeologists speculate that the second supernova, that one in 1054, inspired people who had lived in small farming towns in what's now Illinois to tear down one of them and build Cahokia, a large and influential city that would set off a trend of grand civilizations that archaeologists call Mississippian, that would spread all across the Mississippi Valley and the American Southeast in the following centuries. Cahokia was just one of a constellation of city-states across the continent. Also around 1054, the already sprawling civilization of the Hohokam in what's now Arizona began its greatest period of growth and centralization. Around the world, a combination of portentous signs, agricultural expansion, and human decisions sparked the growth of cities. They became crossroads of economic and cultural exchange on a phenomenal scale. They grew and distributed food for thousands, even tens of thousands of peoples. North America followed this global pattern. But later, Europeans and white Americans couldn't square this urban past with their assumption that Indians were primitive and nomadic, people whose use and ownership of the land were so light that it really didn't belong to them. By overlooking the continent's history of powerful, sophisticated cities in this self-serving way, Europeans and their descendants would justify taking a continent. So, there were large cities, urban civilizations based on large-scale corn farming, corn agriculture in many parts of what's now the United States. Um, but then between the late 12th and late 14th centuries, all of those cities either fell or dramatically decreased in size. One of the, perhaps the main reason was change in climate. So the medieval warm period was a period when the cities rose. Similar things happened in Western Europe as well. The medieval warm period, as its name implies, was a warmer period, a time when the growing season was longer, and weather was fairly predictable, so good for farming. The peoples of North America had farmed for a long time, but the medieval warm period allowed for the expansion of agriculture, the spread of large-scale corn agriculture, and cities were able to grow out of that. Then the weather changed and the planet fell into what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, starting in the 1200s. So there's a period of drought and also flooding, and then the Little Ice Age with shorter growing seasons and much, much more difficult time for large-scale agriculture. And that meant crises for cities, for urban civilizations all around the world, including in North America. And what happened in North America, and this is what both the archaeology and a variety of oral histories tell, is that when the Little Ice Age hit, when it became harder to feed the people and there were famines, people blamed their leaders, blamed people who had founded these cities, who ruled these cities. And gradually over time, the people brought down these leaders, took down these leaders, and spread out into smaller scale civilizations. So I'm just read a little bit about that time period, that period of change, of dramatic change. And remember, this is all before Europeans come. This is all before 1492. Climate change and environmental destruction seem to have been triggers in the fall of North American cities. But each place had its own political, economic, and social factors, most of which are hard to see in the archaeological record alone. In the Ohio Valley and the Cumberland Valley of Tennessee, where Cahokia's influence had inspired the rise of cities, those who had swiftly converted to Cahokia's way of life now rejected it and moved back to smaller towns. Archaeologists have discovered that in the Piedmont region of what's now North Carolina and Georgia, around 1450, people also abandoned the cities and towns. Some places still had towns with pyramid mounds where perhaps leaders and their families lived, but by the 15th century, most people lived on farms. Archaeologists have found tens of thousands of them in the North Georgia Piedmont alone. All across North America, the old era of hierarchy and centralization was ending. People were slowly building more sustainable ways of living that could more predictably feed and shelter people in an unpredictable climate. And they were creating more equitable ways of living together in hopes of preventing leaders from accumulating too much power. And oral histories of a variety of peoples, from peoples in the Southeast to the Southwest and beyond, tell about bringing down the leaders and creating something new. So I talk here about Cherokee oral history. Cherokee oral history tells that there once was a priestly caste called the Anikutani, of whom the people stood in great awe. The Anikutani built pyramids and controlled the religious ceremonies. As the oral history puts it, one oral history puts it, no one knows how they came to power or how long they maintained it, but over a period of time they became haughty, overbearing, and licentious to an intolerable degree. In the words of another version of Cherokee oral history, the people long brooded in silence over the oppressions and outrages of this high caste, whom they deeply hated but greatly feared. The exact spark that started the Cherokee Revolution against the Anikutani varies in different versions, but all tell that, as one puts it, at last their power was annihilated by the nation because the people rose up and destroyed a hereditary secret society, since which time no hereditary privileges have ever been tolerated among the Cherokees. A character in the Cherokee novelist Sequoyah Guess's 1992 novel explains, long ago his ancestors had traded authority for security, but wound up with coercion and fear. The revolution succeeded, though, and it was horrible and bloody lesson. It was a horrible and bloody lesson that needed to be passed down. If they were wise and lucky enough to remember their history, they would never have to learn it again. Lessons told by the descendants of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico similarly tell of a rejected hierarchy. In their version, wizards had misled some leaders who became corrupt and hoarded wealth and power. According to the origin tale of Acoma Pueblo, in the time of Chaco, men accused of mocking the Kachina, which is a religious figure, would be clubbed to death. So this is in the old bad era. But, as the oral history puts it, some people did not approve of this extreme punishment. They fought against the leaders. Others simply left. A large group traveled to a new home where they went through the ceremony of forgetting and left their sickness and trouble behind. In the aftermath of this era, the peoples of North America built a more diversified economy. So there were some places that had not moved into this sort of large scale agriculture and hierarchical political system, but those that did moved back to earlier ways. Um, Continued to farm, absolutely, but started to hunt more and to gather more in order to have a more diversified economy. And also traded more. They'd certainly traded in the past as well, but they traded more with other peoples so that they would have sort of a safety net if the crops failed one year, to not be so dependent on simply agriculture. And they also built forms of consensus politics, elaborate ways of really running what we would call a democracy, of incorporating all of the people into major decisions of the society rather than having an elite or hierarchical political system. All of this was very purposeful. And yet, when Europeans came and saw the ways, sort of native economic ways, native political ways, they defined them as primitive. These are they were purposely crafted, though, to be more egalitarian and more sustainable. As I said, there are many chapters after the coming of Europeans, but the book tries to slow that down and show that it takes centuries before Europeans have power over the continent. It really isn't until about 1750 that Native Americans don't have the majority of the population of North America. And it takes until 1850 for the United States to take control of most of the continent, until the mid 19th century. Native nations still have most of the control over the continent. So various chapters of the book go to different places in this long period. There's one on Roanoke, and I try to tell the history of Roanoke and the short arrival of English in Roanoke from the perspective of Native peoples on the coast of what's now North Carolina. There's one about the small Quapaw Nation in what's now Arkansas, and how they used the French in order to increase their stability in the region. There's a chapter on the Otham, who are descendants of the Hohokam people of Arizona and Sonora that I mentioned, and how they built a diversified economy in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert. And there's a chapter on the Mohawks in the 1600s. So I'm going to just read from that to give you a sense of some of the ways in which Native people were able to make use of Europeans in the early centuries. At this point, the enemies of the Mohawks have gotten weapons from, no, actually, that's a little bit of a spoiler. Let me just say it's 1609 and we're on the banks of Lake Champlain. As the sky began to lighten, the enemy came ashore, and the Mohawk warriors came out of their barricade. The Mohawks were an impressive sight, nearly 200 of them, painted for war, with wooden armor and helmets to protect them from their enemies' arrows, and wearing their distinctive short-feathered headdresses, which inspired terror in their enemies. The approaching Wendat, Algonquin, and Innu warriors let out a cry, and then did something unusual. When they were about 30 steps away from the Mohawks, they parted into two groups, leaving in the middle one man covered in metal from his hat to his knees. As the Mohawks pulled back their bows, preparing to shoot their first round of arrows, they heard an enormous cracking boom, as if thunder and the sound of a waterfall had combined and struck for just a moment right in front of them. One of the Mohawks standing near the front fell down dead, shot right through his wooden armor. The enemy force shouted in delight. Another bang. Another man fell. The Mohawks had never seen guns, and it was astonishing to see people fall without being hit by an arrow. If we rush too fast through the 17th century, we might interpret the arrival of guns as the start of native dependence and European dominance. But we would be wrong. Local rivalries, customs, and geography continue to be the most important factors in native decisions and determine the opportunities and limits for Europeans. There had been new weapons before and new ways of defending against them. When your enemy gained some advantage, you adapted, and that is what the Mohawks did. So these enemies of the Mohawks had been armed by the French at Quebec. And so the Mohawks start to go to New Netherland to try to trade with the Dutch to get the same kinds of weapons that their enemies have been getting from the French. And they basically get the Dutch to found a trading post near them that the Dutch call Fort Orange. It's where Albany, New York is today. Mohawks came to Fort Orange for the guns, but they stayed for the cake. When they visited Fort Orange, they sampled Dutch cakes, cookies, and bread, and took some home for others to try. The excellence of Dutch baking was universally recognized. The English word cookie, in fact, comes from the Dutch. Mohawk women made cornbread, but it may have seemed dense and everyday when compared with the treat of an airy yeasted white bread, fine cake, or cookie after making the trip to Fort Orange with a load of beaver furs and baskets of corn. To the frustration of many colonists, Mohawks' proceeds from the fur trade allowed the Mohawks to pay high prices. The Dutch colonists who introduced white bread and cakes to the region soon could not afford them. Colonists repeatedly complained to the New Netherland Council that bakers sifted whole wheat flour and sold the white flour, and this is the words of one of these petitions, sold the white flour greatly to their profit to the Indians for the baking of sweet cake, white bread, cookies, and pretzels, leaving largely bran to sell to the townspeople. The petition concluded in horror. The Christians must eat the bran while the Indians eat the flour. In an effort to appease colonists, the council outlawed the sale of white bread and cake to native customers. But as with guns and liquor, native demand prevailed. Bakers continued selling baked goods made from white flour to their best customers, the Mohawks. Selling products that Mohawks wanted made the Dutch fur trade thrive. By the 1630s, New Netherland was exporting tens of thousands of furs every year, mostly from Mohawk sources. Trade worked in native reciprocal fashion. Mohawks profited, and the Dutch profited, even if some of them had to eat heavy whole wheat bread while Mohawks ate cake. Now, some native nations, especially those on the Atlantic coast, places like Virginia, that faced large numbers of English settlers early in the colonial process. They have a quite different history from most native nations in the interior, in that they were surrounded by and had to deal with large numbers of colonists long before the rest of the continent did. What really changes for most Native nations, those and the majority of them that are in the interior, is the creation of the United States and its growing power and growing population as it begins to take over the continent. And so for many Native nations, things get harder. For most Native nations, there's a long period of trade and relations with various European empires. And that begins to get more difficult with the rise and the spread of the United States. So I'm just going to read a bit from the Cherokees in the early 19th century. So we're skipping, to note that we're skipping 2 centuries here from where we were with the Mohawks. This is 2 centuries later. It's just after the American Revolution. The Cherokees have had a major loss during the American Revolution, and their first loss of lands that had towns on them. So they lost some hunting lands in earlier years, but in the American Revolution, that's the first time the Cherokees lose some land that had towns on it. Cherokees determined to hold on to their remaining lands and sovereignty not through war anymore, but by way of strong and consistent diplomacy, to insist on their right to continue as a neighboring nation to the United States. To do so, they would need to end the diffuse decision-making that had allowed U.S. officials and even individual land speculators to persuade a few Cherokee men to sign agreements to sell off the Cherokee Nation piece by piece. The most important function of the newly centralized Cherokee national government would be to protect Cherokee land and sovereignty against their aggressive neighbor. Sometimes US-focused histories assume that these changes were motivated by a desire to imitate or impress the United States. In fact, early 19th century Cherokee political leaders wanted the Cherokee Nation to take its place among the nations of the world and have its sovereignty respected by other nations. Just as the fledgling United States claimed to be among the powers of the earth in its Declaration of Independence, the Cherokee Nation would assert itself as a global sovereign presence. Cherokees had killed one another in political disputes in the past, including over ceding land to the United States. But in 1809, they made structural changes that allowed them to speak largely with one voice for more than 2 decades. The immediate impetus came when a rumor circulated that Principal Chief Black Fox was considering trading Cherokee land for land west of the Mississippi River. Opponents deposed the principal chief. This new emergency easily could have led to more violence and death and maybe to civil war, but the Cherokees were determined to stop the cycle of land cessions and retributions. In the fall of 1809, women and men gathered at the Cherokee town of Willstown and agreed to reinstate Black Fox as principal chief, but also to appoint his opponents to important offices. The National Council wrote to declare their newly unified message to the United States. So they wrote to the United States, "It has now been a long time that we have been much confused and divided in our opinions, but now we have settled our affairs to the satisfaction of both parties and become as one. You will now hear from us not from the lower towns, nor the upper towns, but from the whole Cherokee Nation." They agreed to oppose all future land cessions and made changes to their governing structure, including written laws and a centralized national government. They hoped that instituting what Europeans and their descendants in the Americas saw as modern governance would give them the legal power and status as a sovereign nation to resist the United States. They also centralized governance to try to prevent groups of chiefs from acting on their own. These changes were part of a global pattern of redefining nationhood with written laws. Cherokees and many others, including the founders of the United States and contemporaneous nationalizing leaders in France and in Germany later, and Italy, hoped to create this kind of politically centralized sovereignty, recognized by people both within and outside the nation as binding a certain kind of people together. So by various means of centralizing, as working together within and sometimes across Native nations, large number of Native nations, today more than 600 federally and state recognized tribes, survived through the hardest periods of colonialism, through the 19th century, through the 20th century. Even as over and over, there were attempts by the US government, by various state governments to destroy them. And over time, their survival strategies had to change. We don't have time to talk about all these different ways, but in the book we see multiple survival strategies from peoples like the Lumbees now on the coast of North Carolina, through the Kiowas on the plains. So let me just finish up here so we leave some time for questions with some words from the conclusion. Tohono O'odham elder Mary Jane Wanmore recalls how one year her grandmother returned to her family's saguaro camp for the season, saguaro cactus camp, as she had for her entire life and her ancestors had before her. Yet when she got to the camp, her pots for boiling the saguaro syrup were gone. Someone had come upon this place, her family's property, and taken them. So when Wanmore sees a Tohono O'odham pot in a museum, she often thinks, that pot is probably my grandmother's. In 1983, the UNC Research Laboratories of Archaeology began excavating the Occaneechi village on the banks of the Eno River near Hillsborough, North Carolina, not knowing that Native people whose ancestors had likely lived at that town were living just a few miles away. Today, though, collaborations between tribes and academic researchers, including UNC archaeologists, provide information about the past that was impossible to recreate when scholars didn't acknowledge Native people in their midst. And the American Indian designers, curators, and administrators of the National Museum of the American Indian on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and in New York City, have built, in large part with funding from Native nations, not a museum focused on colonization and loss, but a monument to the Native present in all its diversity, with connections to the past and the future. Despite the tremendous losses of the past 2 centuries, Native nations have survived, not only as the descendants of once powerful peoples, but as nations within the nation states of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Since 2000, the U.S. Census has counted more and more Native Americans, with the 2020 census reporting an astounding 9.7 million. U.S. policies did unfathomable damage, but Native Americans repeatedly rebuilt their nations and figured out how to continue being their own distinct peoples within a vastly changed continent. Richard West, who's Southern Cheyenne and founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, says, in the United States, all of us who call ourselves Native peoples have a profound feeling that a powerful renaissance is sweeping Indian America. The worst, which was very bad indeed, is over, and our confidence in our sense of cultural time and place is growing with each day. Joy Harjo, who's Muskogee and was U.S. Poet Laureate from 2019 to 2022, closes her poem Anchorage with the bittersweet message of surviving genocide. She writes, who would believe the fantastic and terrible story of all of our survival, those who were never meant to survive? So I'll close with that, and I think we'll have some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. DuVal. We have a couple, and if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. This is an overall question for everyone. I know that some people haven't been able to sign on today and we're on the wait list, but the program is being recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube channel later next week. Our first question, do you have any chapters on the fur trade and the importance of Indigenous women in trade relations?
I do, absolutely. So it comes up in several different places. In the Mohawk chapter, I talk some about women's part in the fur trade there, both as producers and as consumers, as we talked about there. But then also there's a chapter that comes a couple centuries later, comes in the 19th century, about the Kiowas on the plains, and the very changed nature of women's work there. Kiowa women go from being spending most of their time being the farmers. So they were in charge of. So the Kiowas once upon a time lived in river towns on rivers, and they were farming people. And so women were in charge of the farming, as women were in most Native societies, most Native American societies. And then Kiowa women, like all plains women who became nomadic hunters, their role in their economy, their place in society dramatically changed when their society sort of took to horseback. So they adopted a horsebound, nomadic lifestyle. They had not been nomads before in any way. And women were still in charge of parts of feeding and sort of taking care of the housing, like the now on the move, teepees on the move, but also took on this huge new role in processing furs and hides for the fur trade, and then making some of those into other goods that they sold, like moccasins and robes and clothing. So yes,
Thank you. Our next question. One thing I continue to notice is that oral histories are often disregarded Native histories. How do you believe that this is shifting?
yeah. So I think, there one thing is that I do think sort of scholars outside of tribes are taking those more seriously and see them as an essential part of how we understand the past. And I think that's part of a greater understanding by scholars that all of our sources have certain purposes and motivations and things that are useful about them, and that oral histories fall into that as well. And there's something that scholars can use sort of even outside of the system of oral history production. But at the same time, I think, in part because beginning at some time in the 20th century, basically the US government more or less shifted its emphasis from really trying to destroy Native nations to sort of not trying to destroy Native nations. And there's some back and forth, and it's not always in that direction, but it's a tremendously important difference. And so there's been I think, a gradual willingness, this is to generalize more than I should probably, but a gradual willingness within tribes of sharing more and more of their oral histories, their oral traditions with outsiders, which I think for a long time they were very reluctant to do because they've been misused so often, ignored, but also that just there was so much sort of effort, official effort to try to get rid of things like this and destroy Native practices and customs that, yeah, I think those are the sort of two reasons that there's a pretty big change in yeah, in the use of oral history in what sort of academic historians are doing.
Thank you. How important is it today that books such as yours from an Indigenous perspectives are presented to teach and inform others?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. And I should point out, I am not Indigenous, but I try to incorporate as many Indigenous perspectives, plural, as possible in here. And I just think, that the sort of old ways of teaching this to students, or to the public generally, was just so thin. And there's so much to be seen in Native history. And I know, it's hard for, say, K through 12 teachers to fit in anymore, the curriculum is, we already ask so much of them. But I think there's some ways that things can be substituted. So maybe some of those old stories of, they're important histories of victimization and such, maybe that's not the most important thing for K through 12 students to learn. Maybe the most important things are about sort of Native diversity, Native experiences beyond those tragedies, and Native resilience and survival into the present.
Alrighty. We're going to take a couple more. This one, in your book, you do speak to the role of Native critique of Western societies in the development of present-day Western politics, such as the Cherokee foundation of the U.S. Constitution or the democratic and egalitarian sense of many North American tribes. I don't really know where the question is. I think it's because they're speaking about their experience in high school and learning about Native
Mm.
American history and its role there. And they mention the book, let's see, they mentioned a teacher that they had at that time. And I think they're trying to put in your book, do you speak to the role of Native critique of Western societies?
Yeah, I do. And so I think in a variety of ways, and I think just simply by looking at these, we have this centuries and centuries long history of democracies in North America. And so the United States is only 250 years old. We have much older democracies here. And I think there are things, we can all learn, including probably tribal governments these days, right, can learn about how some of those systems worked or tried to work, the values of reciprocal consensus-based democracies of the past. So I think that's one of just many ways to think about that.
Okay. We can ask maybe one or two more questions. Your work covers this grand scope of North America geography. How can local writers employ your approach to investigating and retelling Native histories at the watershed or the regional scale?
Yeah, I think that is so important. And I think, I all along the way, I learned so much from Native scholars who are working within their tribes. And so I think that is the first place to start is, I know you have amazing work going on in Virginia. You have great people you can learn from, both who are doing work within tribes and collaborations between tribal scholars and scholars outside the tribes. So I think there's so much to learn there. One of the things I say just sort of generally to people in the United States is one of the first things to do is just look up the tribal websites for the tribes closest to you, or, if you're in a place where the tribes were removed from, the ones that used to live in your region and now are in Oklahoma or wherever they are now. Um, and I think that is not only on tribal websites can you often learn about, what they have to say about their history and their version of their history, which is definitely the most important place to learn from. You can also see what a modern tribe does. And so many people who are not familiar with tribes today, and I do this with my students, are amazed when they go to just any tribal website to just see the kind of business that tribes do, the kind of educational programs they have for their people, sometimes language programs and childcare programs and all the kinds of things that governments do in some cases, in the cases of the larger tribes. I think that's one place to start.
Thank you. And here at the Library of Virginia, a couple years ago, we did an exhibit called Indigenous Perspectives. You can check that out on the library's education
Yes, right.
page that has oral interviews from 9 of the 11 state and federally recognized tribes.
Yeah,
And
thank you,
this
Ashley. I should have said that. Absolutely.
It's okay. We do have one question surrounding federal recognition, and it's dealing with the Lumbee tribe. Do you have
Sure.
any information on why the Lumbees haven't received federal recognition
Okay,
as they
so
had?
I mean, yeah, and I think, I'm a historian, so I'm gonna go way back to answer this question instead of talk about, the last few weeks or something, which is a little less my expertise. Um, as I mentioned in my talk, there's just, you know, there's so okay, I didn't say this in my talk, but just to say federal recognition is easiest for tribes that have a treaty relationship with the United States. So, say if we look at the Kiowas or the Navajos or the Comanches or the Cherokees, or the Chickasaws or the Mohawks, they have a history of direct treaties with the United States. But there are many tribes, especially on the coasts, on the Atlantic coast, around New Orleans, and in California, um, that were surrounded by colonists, limited by colonization before the creation of the United States. And that makes federal recognition, it is not a perfect or particularly good process anyway, but it makes the process of federal recognition almost ridiculous, given the history of those tribes long before there was a United States. Many of those tribes have treaties with European governments. There just wasn't a United States yet. So that's one of the reasons that Virginia's tribes those that have federal recognition today, didn't get it that long ago. These are tribes that met English colonists at Jamestown in 1607, right? They're certainly native nations with long, long histories in the places where they are now. But the federal recognition process it is not designed well to acknowledge that long history. Now, the Lumbees particularly are another hurdle for the Lumbees is they are a conglomeration tribe. They are multiple different peoples, even multiple peoples who spoke different languages, who came together for refuge, right, for community long ago, because they were surrounded by English colonists. And so for the Lumbees have always Indians and always been known by Indians, by themselves and by their neighbors. But it is hard for them to establish a single, uninterrupted, undisrupted identity in the distant past that is the same as today, because it's not the same. They've changed over time because of this conglomeration. So that has stood in the way of Lumbee recognition. I think they're closer to it than they've ever been before. And North Carolina's, both of North Carolina's U.S. senators support Lumbee federal recognition. But it's a complicated process.
Yes, most of Virginia's tribes did not get their federal recognition until 2018 with the Thomasina E. Jordan Act. So it did take from 1607 up until 2018 for Virginia's tribes to get federal recognition.
Right.
For our last question, what are your thoughts on the movement of Indigenous people into U.S. cities, leaving their traditional tribal communities and homelands?
Yeah, so it's a fascinating process, and there are lots of different versions of this story. Probably every person involved in it has a different version of this story, but it's a really fascinating and important step in the progression of Native American history. And so one of the, I think today, the majority of Native Americans don't live on reservations or don't live in the homeland that their tribes have today. Um, but most of them retain ties with their people. They usually have relatives that they go back and visit. Tribes themselves have homecomings and powwows and elections, things that bring people back home, even who have never lived on the reservation. And so I think one of the parts of the Renaissance that's going on among many, many tribes today is how to maintain those ties, how to have in most cases, a population base that lives near one another, but also a large part, and sometimes the majority of one's population, one's citizens that live somewhere else as well. And then also, I would say that movement is part, and a variety of other things that happened in the 20th century, the experience of men and women with the world wars, either serving the war or going to the cities to work. Even things like boarding schools that took people, forced children away from home, but sometimes in the best circumstances, there were awful circumstances as well, led to Native children, Native young adults from different tribes, from different languages, who had never gotten to know each other, working together for both tribal sovereignty and U.S. citizenship. That's one of the things that happened in the 20th century. That has led to where we are today, where Native Americans are citizens of their own native nations and also citizens of the United States.
Well, thank you, Dr. DuVal. This has been fantastic. You're getting a lot of praise in the chat and the
Terrific.
questions. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Please stay tuned to the library's website for more upcoming programs.